Okay. So for tonight, we're kind of like on a series about kind of like emotional, mental well-being and health. Because it's not, when God like laid it out for me, basically the point was this, is that it's not something well discussed in the church. It's not something well discussed in general. Even when you get into psychology, there's still a lot of gray area about things because they don't really know how to do everything. It's not like, it's not like physical medicine where you can inhibit pain receptors or different things like that. This is the way that people think. Mm-hmm. This is the way that people feel. We don't have as much control over our emotionality or each other's emotionality, and what we can do tends to not be good. Like if your entire thing is to be able to shut down somebody's emotions, that's not beneficial. You rob them of an entire part of who they are. In fact, there was a story about this one guy. I'd almost forgotten about this. He got a form of brain damage that caused him to lose, like it basically destroyed the part of his brain dedicated to emotions. Mm. And it's always been a question of what people have always wondered, can a being exist based purely on logic? And it turns out that the answer is actually no. In the case of this man, his ability to feel emotions, to feel things, was what ultimately is a deciding factor in making decisions. When it came to making decisions, all he could do was go in circles over the information. This is true, but then this is also true, but then this is true, but then this is true. Then there's this facet. So when it's based on pure logic, you exist in this kind of null zone, because at some point you have to make a decision based on what you feel is best, what you feel is most acceptable. That's a part of judgment that a lot of us don't really work within. And we don't really understand, even like up until that point in time, a lot of people didn't realize like how much emotional aspect was involved in making decisions like that. Fantasy and so on. We've got people writing about machines coming up with the idea that, this is the best case for human beings and different things like that. I mean, Age of Ultron was had that aspect to it. But when it comes down to it, the reality is that it's not, gathering up all of the information doesn't always give you a clear answer. At some point you have to make a decision. And oftentimes that's based off of how you feel. And that ties in probably more than is comfortable with this message. Because tonight we're talking about trauma. Now, trauma is a very, very big subject. You can get into all kinds of the various different forms of abuses that people go through, childhood trauma, emotional trauma, physical trauma, all of which can affect a person mentally, emotionally, spiritually. Spiritual trauma is a thing as well. People have had moments where they've been attacked by demons or spirits, or had moments where they felt like God had betrayed them, different things like that when it was important. These things happen. Like, it's quaint to believe that everything that happens in the church is always succinct, and that it's always very, very easy, in the sense that, like, you're either with God or you're not with God. When in reality, there's a lot of gray area as we kind of try to learn what God is like and how that meshes with us and our world, and how we try to give those other things away to Him, but we have to see them to do it.
Yeah.
And that's the thing, when you are so conditioned, when you are trained to see things only one way, you think about like the concept of time, for example. We're constantly pressured by time, by deadlines. God is not. And the thing that we run into is like we have things coming up and we're just like getting anxious and frustrated and angry over the fact that God's not giving us a direction in order to get to this particular time, get within this time frame. And then we wonder why. And we spend so much time having so many different emotions come and well up over this concept because our understanding of it is linear. I am here right now, and I need to have a decision made before I get here. And I am moving that direction, and there is no other way for me to go. Whereas for God, He's not bound by any of that. He knows that you have the entire scope of that time frame. We all want the comfort of having a decision made like right over here. And for Him, He's just like, it's fine. Let's talk about your heart and where it's at with me. I need a decision now. I don't have time to sit here and talk about how I feel about things. I do. Okay. And then we get angry. It's just kind of a thing that we run into. Like, these are the kinds of things that we struggle with God. And there are times when, and it's just the reality of what relationship looks like. Because we're so accustomed to so many different things that we have a hard time dropping those things. We don't even see so many of them. How many of us sit back when there's a decision to be made, within a certain time frame and say, how much time do I have? We say we need a decision now. That's how we're trained to think. That's how we're trained. That's our conditioning. And
trained to be prepared.
Right.
Basically.
And the thing that comes up with trauma is that trauma institutes a new form of conditioning. But the thing about it is if everything is a teacher, trauma is a very, very bad teacher.
Yeah.
See, the reason why is that it's not just because it sends us into different spirals. It's not just because of the things that caused the trauma. It's the way that we respond mentally, subconsciously. It's been mentioned before how certain things like PTSD, people who have issues with PTSD, it's almost like the pathways have been etched into their brains. And it's very hard to retrain yourself to go around those things. A lot of clinical psychologists have a hard time with PTSD patients because of those particular reasons. Like, you take like a war vet, for example. When you're being trained to go to war, they intentionally condition you to function a certain way. If you hear a loud sound, you should respond this way. If you hear gunfire, you should respond this way. And that gets galvanized when you're put into a state where that has to be applied. Like, one of the things is that even in basic training, they're not beyond traumatizing you in order to force you to believe and function a certain way. Like, I know that was a big part of the shark attack. Before I joined the Army, I studied the mentality of like drill sergeants and things like that, and their training methodologies and why they train the way they do, so that because I don't like doing things unless I have like a plan or some kind of like understanding of what I'm getting into. And going to a place where people were going to teach me how to kill other people in order to further my government's goals, I wanted to know what I was getting into.
Yeah.
I had very little trust for said government or anything like that to begin with, less now. But the point was that, I studied the mentalities behind all of this, so that I knew, when they're trying to smoke you, what they're trying to do, when they use intimidation, when they use threats. There were also like a little bit of study on the laws, so it's like, well, I know they can't hit me, so that's a thing. But the thing that we run into with that is that I saw, like, the shark attack was the first day that everybody goes down range. So you go to reception and you spend your time there getting all your gear, getting your haircut, getting your information, getting like pay stuff figured out, and then you go down range. They throw you on a bus with all the other recruits, all of which are dumbly excited, looking forward to finally getting to do all that cool army stuff, and then you get yanked out of the bus and screamed at and forced to run and do push-ups and yelled at more. And if you say anything wrong or make eye contact wrong or anything, you get pulled aside in front of everybody else and like run through a great deal of motions, screamed at, humiliated, whatever. We had so many guys break down on that first day. And then the rest of that time was spent watching them slowly degrade mentally. Now, the idea is to remove the mentally weak from the situation, the people who can't handle that. And because the important thing is if you put somebody into, their logic is if you put somebody into a battlefield situation, you can't have people who are going to break down psychologically. But the kind of downside of this is that, one, you take random people who have signed up for this and you break them down psychologically. What's more is sometimes you have other people who break down other ways. And it doesn't present as like, this person obviously has an anxiety disorder who can't handle this. Instead, you get really messed up stuff. Like, we had one guy who we found out later had intentions of pedophilia. So he was going to, he was looking at it in the sense that I'm going to go to Iraq and I'm going to go fight in this war, and when I'm left alone with the children, they're mine. And that was his mentality. We found that out later, and he ended up being sent to the psych ward. But it's just like the trauma as it presented took him down a very different path than the people who were breaking down psychologically in the more obvious ways.
Anxiety attacks.
Anxiety attacks, or different things. And then other people, we had one guy who had really, really bad ADHD, and they dictated him as being untrainable because he couldn't follow their orders properly. But all that to say, so they intentionally pushed these buttons to try to cause these reactions. And as a result, a lot of people suffered a lot of trauma, and it created a certain atmosphere in the barracks as people were trying to cope with what life was like. No one had any kind of interaction with family or friends or anybody from their own life. Everyone's isolated. So you're just stuck with a bunch of random people from around the country, and you have to try to generate relationships there in order to keep your sanity. The people overseeing you and who have power over you are content to abuse you and manipulate you and screw with you in every which way. And they get off on that. You'll see them laugh at each other, laugh about it and joke and point fingers at you and the other guys while they do these things. And this is this is a scenario in which it's a controlled environment where they're creating what can be a traumatic experience for a great many people. And that's hard. And as a result, you end up seeing these things pop up. You see these things happen. It's kind of like getting to see the process that a lot of us don't have any control over. We just have it happen. whether it's our parents or we're bullied, or, our churches or society at large, who attack some aspect of who you are or who you have been, and makes you a villain or a monster or something to that extent. All of those things can be traumatizing in their own regard. And all of those things cause you to generate a different reaction. Just like the training in basic is engineered to create certain pathways, to create automatic responses. That's why I like a lot of vets. When they come back home from war, they hear fireworks on the 4th of July and they can't handle that. All that they're doing is they're having flashbacks to explosions, but it's even more than that. Even in basic training, we had our drill sergeants throwing bombs at us.
What?
And in order to create reactions. Not I can't say it was safe, but it wasn't it wasn't like...
It was to shock you. And
yeah, exactly.
Basically throw you off your game.
Really
Yeah.
more sound than anything.
More like the sound and an actual explosion and different things like that.
Trying to create knee-jerk reactions
Mhm.
that are desirable.
Or open gunfire during certain exercises where we had to crawl through obstacle courses. Yeah. The point is that as a result, your brain creates different reactions, and it tells you that this is how you have to act every step of the way. And the reason why this is problematic, the reason why I say it's a bad teacher, is because it doesn't teach you the best way. It teaches you what works at that moment. I have a niece of sorts. She was adopted, and she grew up in the streets of the Philippines with her little brother. And when she was about 2 years old, she had to make decisions that no child should make about how to feed her little brother. They were abandoned by her parents effectively, or her mom specifically just didn't care, and would occasionally sell her daughter out for drugs. And when they ran away from their mom, the daughter only understood one particular avenue by which she could make money to buy food for her brother. And in the midst of that particular trauma, this is how it works for her. If she needs something or wants something, she offers herself. And that's still... I don't know where she's at now entirely, but I do know that that was still the case the last time that I had been out there to visit and see this part of my family. And these are the kinds of things that trauma teaches us. If you're met with a problem, with an obstacle, you're trained to go dark, to be violent, to be sexualized, to be numb. There are a lot of different things that it teaches us to do, but none of which are necessarily the best for dealing with the situation or getting through it. It's the kind of thing where that innate training that happens, that conditioning that happens to your brain in response to the trauma, it creates scenarios in which you can be met with things that have simple solutions. But because of that one trigger, it makes it impossible for you to approach that logically or soundly. And instead, in your trauma, you respond. I think of this one guy I know who has a hard time, if anybody touches the back of his neck, he flips out. And that's because of abuse that he went through. But it just becomes this thing. It's he'll wrestle with people and have fun. He likes doing that. But the moment that part happens, it stops being wrestling. It stops being fun. It's suddenly, he's right back into those places of trauma. So even though this was something that was controlled and he was having fun with it and it was good and enjoyable, it's ruined by the moment that this one little thing happens. So in this regard, we're taught to do what works at that time. We're taught to react with something that a sort of training that is just established in us. And that's how that's how our subconscious tells us, this is how you act when this happens. And the hardest part about it, and why it's particularly nefarious, is it works. It works to fix the situation, even if it's only temporarily, even if it's stopping the situation. It doesn't matter what it is. It's the result that matters, because your brain is trained. It's kind of like with a lot of things in our brains, where we get it's reward responses. If you do this, then your brain rewards you with good feelings. It's that kind of deal. Your brain rewards you with a good feeling about having ended this situation that's going to make you, potentially dangerous. But the thing about it is the triggers that cause us to believe certain things, where our amygdala kind of gets involved and teaches us how to react subconsciously. We end up with these particular issues where it's you get into a customer service job and you find yourself with a yelling customer, and maybe somebody was emotionally abusive and they screamed at you, and that's the trigger. Well, lo and behold, you don't respond to that well. This yelling customer could easily be handled by some other employee. But because it's you and you have this stuff in you, you are trained to respond a certain way, and maybe you blow up back, maybe you run, maybe you leave, maybe whatever happens, it happens.
Literally had this situation, and my response was to run and be like, sorry, I have to hang up.
Mm-hmm.
I was on the phone.
Yeah. But your brain tells you that was the right way to handle it, and even rewards you to some extent for doing that. And it makes it hard. I think one of my cousins put it best when she had just gotten out of a very abusive marriage and was struggling with the aftermath of it. And she was specifically having a lot of issues with anxiety. And I remember one night I was talking to her because I was living with her at the time, and she just looked at me and she was like, I think back to everything the way I was before this, and how none of these things bothered me. And now I can't even be in a room with some people because they cause me to lose it. And she was like, how did I forget to people? Because that's what trauma trains us to do. It trains us to forget how to be people. It trains us to respond to things in a certain way. It puts you in a survival state. But survival is a matter of existing and continuing to exist, not doing well in that existence. One of the big arguments about evolution forever and ever and ever has been about random mutations and whether they are beneficial or not, and the likelihood of beneficial mutations being incredibly rare statistically. But the point is that how many times there was a study done on fruit flies, Drosophila specifically, and they were establishing just in the generations and generations and generations how many good beneficial mutations came up, and it wasn't high. And you can get a lot of generations of Drosophila fruit flies in a year. So it's not like this was a long-term study. They could do this for a year and get tons and tons of data. But the point was that the statistical circumstance where they got good mutations was very, very rare. So in these cases, survival of the fittest was not benefiting those with the mutations. And using that physical example, we see a thing where what happens when our minds create these kinds of anomalies. You know, if you have a fruit fly with 4 wings, but 2 of them don't work because it doesn't actually have the muscles to make them work, all it means is that it's got extra weight and weird airspeed problems. So when it tries to fly, since flies are designed to fly with 2 wings, most of them, it throws them off, and it can't fly as well, which means it just gets picked off by things that want to eat it. It's slow, and it's tiny and tasty for birds and things. And this is the kind of thing that develops in us. On a psychological level, we're developing things that they help us get further along. In a sense, they look like they might be beneficial. They seem beneficial at times, but they're not. It's like other examples in real life were things like sickle cell anemia. That's right. In Africa, there are large populations of people who have sickle cell anemia. Now, sickle cell anemia is a disease. It's a mutation in your blood cells. Your red blood cells have more of a teardrop shape. And what happens is that they tend to clump together in your arteries and in your veins. And as a result, this can cause all kinds of heart problems, different conditions all throughout you. However, in these certain portions of Africa, the people with sickle cell anemia were the most likely to survive to adulthood and spread their genes because malaria was so significant. And the way the malaria parasite works is that it hooks itself onto blood cells, and the way it fits perfectly on the blood cells allows it to hold on to them. Well, with those sickle cell, with the teardrop-shaped ones, it couldn't cling on, so the malaria would fall off. And as a result, you have people surviving because of this mutation, but it wasn't a beneficial mutation. It was dangerous for the people. It was bad for them in general. It's destructive to their health, but they weren't getting killed by malaria. So they lived. And mind you, like, I believe the average lifespan for somebody with sickle cell anemia is about 40. So it wasn't like they were living long lives. And these are the kinds of things that we kind of have to look at when thinking about trauma. This will come up a lot when we're talking about these like psychological things, that I'm going to point back to physical examples, because for whatever reason, we're more hardwired to understand a physical example than a psychological one. If I talk about depression, like next week, and I refer to like, you trying to walk with your feet cut off, you can understand that better than to say, depression's like a weight that holds you in place. Because we all kind of sit there and say, we can overcome that. It's not a problem. It's not a big deal. I can beat that. Until you put like a physical example on this. In the case of this trauma runs so much deeper. It's in your blood, it's in your heart, it's in your lungs, it's in your vital organs. It's like poison. It's like mercury that's been absorbed for decades and is now making you sick because you've got heavy metals in your organs. Trauma is something that exists in us and makes us react and believe certain things to be true. And it's very, very, very hard to get past them. Because anytime we have a trigger, anytime that we respond to that trigger, our brain tells us we did the right thing. And it locks that further into our minds to believe this was the correct decision. This was the correct way to handle this.
Confirmation bias.
Exactly. And that's what makes it so nefarious and so hard. And the thing about it is that what's important about trauma And this is just me establishing the point that, look, it's bad, okay? It's not beneficial for us. And that's an important thing for us to understand, because it's really easy to slip into these mindsets of like, well, it saved me in these situations. Sure, it has saved you in these particular situations, but now those situations are over. And now you have to live a life separated from those situations. It's why like a lot of vets have a hard time reassociating to life outside of the military. It's why a lot of vets live their lives as career military, because everything makes sense there. Everything that you're trained from, everything that your brain has now trained you to do, makes sense there. I had a friend from high school, for example, and he's currently, I think he got out of prison, but he was deemed a defector and a a traitor to the United States of America, because what he did was he signed up for the military right out of high school. He went to Iraq, he fought, and was there for his entire term, and then they pulled him from war. His term was over, and he was free. He re-enlisted, but they wouldn't let him go back. They had a time frame for him, and he couldn't wait. So he left, and he joined the French Foreign Legion. And, just for those who don't know, the French Foreign Legion is traditionally it's a mercenary force that is important for the French military. It has a long, long history. And they call it the French Foreign Legion because basically it's a unit of people from other places. Usually mercenaries, not always necessarily, but they're loyal to the French, to France. So he signed up with them and got himself back out into Iraq and Afghanistan and fighting more wars and fighting more battles and staying in that same state where things made sense. And in the interview that they had with him, where after he came back I think it was he was visiting family, and he got dinged and taken prisoner and was going to be on trial for being a traitor. Because as an American citizen, you can't join a foreign military force of any kind and still be an American citizen. I don't know if he knew that or not, or understood that or not, but the point was that when he was interviewed about this and they asked him, why'd you do it? And he explained how he couldn't focus. When he was sent home, he couldn't focus without the training, without the regiment, without the clear direction of things.
Routine, yeah.
He had to have that. And that's why he was so pressed to go back out to do it again, to the point that he would sacrifice his citizenship. But it's just one of those things, like a lot of vets, they have such a hard time coming down. It's like if you're trained and pushed and trained and pushed and trained and pushed, and you're up here now, you're escalated to this point, and this is where you live, and this is what's comfortable now. Then you come home, and you're supposed to live a life of peace, and they don't really train you to de-escalate. Like, I remember being sent to Headed Home Corps, and that was like X amount of time spent sitting in a room watching movies and eating snacks and sleeping. It wasn't detraining anybody. It wasn't helping anybody deal with the process. It was just chill out over here for a bit. As I understand it, they're working on doing better with that now, but at the point in time that my friend was in, they did not have anything like that. So he's trained here, and now you're supposed to live down here. And a lot of those things that you do, a lot of those reactions, it's not appropriate. Like if you hear a sound, a twig snap in your backyard, It's not appropriate to grab your rifle and fire into the darkness. In a battlefield situation, that might be totally justified, and you might be trained to react that way. But it doesn't work in peace. Suddenly the neighbor's cat is very dead and you have a lot of explaining to do. But see, the thing about it is that we, talking about this trauma, and I'm using a lot of like military references, but the truth is that that's not what a lot of us have. A lot of us have stuff from childhood. When I look back at our group, a lot of us have, most of the people in our group have trauma from childhood. That's probably the most consistent, most common thing that everyone has endured. Our parents were terrible, and they did terrible things, and as a result we're trained to react to certain things certain ways. Like to put myself out on the chopping block, I know that I had one stepdad in particular. Like, for example, I will always eat with my mouth closed, and I get very, very touchy about other people eating with their mouths open, because that was a point of like, that was worthy of a spanking. If you ate with your mouth open, smacked your lips, that stepdad in particular would do that. That was an offense worthy of that level of punishment. So different things like that. Not interrupting people is another one. I've kind of been able to let that go a little bit over the past few years, but up until about 3 years ago, that was very much a thing. If somebody was talking, they would talk, and I would listen, and I would wait. And then the moment that I had a chance, then I would interject something once they were done. And again, that was another punishable offense. If I interrupted that man while he talked, it was a rough time. And there are stories, like mine isn't that bad compared to what some people have gone through in this group, what some people have endured from their parents, from their families. I remember my grandpa used to think it was funny to like put out cigarettes on the back of my neck, just for fun. That was just for if we got too close to him while we were playing with toys or something like that. We had to learn to give him a wide berth, otherwise he'd like pull out our hair or burn us with something. And so that was a thing. And I say all that knowing that there are worse stories in the people in this group, because I know you guys' stories. So parents are a big source of trauma. And the really problematic thing about parents is that they're the people who have had the greatest influence on us, teaching us how to function in life, teaching us how to move forward. Family is supposed to be a thing that trains us how to live and be. And most people in this group have not had that be their experience. We have some whose experiences have been outside of that. The church is probably the second biggest thing in this group in particular that has caused trauma. Churches that abandoned us, rejected us, humiliated us, looked at us as, rather than meeting us with understanding or even attempting to understand or reconciliation or prayer or anything, met us with violence, aggression, rejection, abandonment, deceit, betrayal. Like, we have gone through a lot with the church. There are a few people where it's spouse relationships that they were in for a long term. And I say spouse, but that extends out to boyfriends, girlfriends, different things like that, partners. People who endured terrible things at the hands of people who were supposed to love them. And as a result, there are so many aspects of trauma there, where there are some who don't believe they're lovable at this point. There are others who desperately need to find somebody to love them, to make them feel okay again. And that's, again, like a trauma response. And then there are those who have been bullied, where they were basically made a spectacle by people, and of course that may have been the church, that may have been their families, that may have been whoever, but it also may have just been friends or other people, random people they didn't even know, didn't even have any reason to know at school. And suddenly school, some other social gathering, and suddenly they've been put on display to be treated like garbage. And there's more. But the point is in all of these instances, like, most people in this group have endured some form of trauma and are now living in reaction to that trauma. And that's the thing that's really hard, is it's hard to look at this stuff, like that verse. I did not miss this.
Yeah.
Yeah, not one bit. Anyway, that verse, "Catch for us the little foxes," out of Song of Solomon, chapter 2, I believe it's verse 12. It's one of the few that I was able to find. Anyway, go ahead and read it real quick. No, not 12. There it is, 15. Let's see here. My dove in the clefts of the rock, in the hiding places on the mountainside, show me your face. Let me hear your voice. Your voice is sweet, and your face is lovely. Catch for us the foxes, the little foxes that ruin the vineyards, our vineyards that are in bloom. Now, Song of Solomon is, of course, effectively a dialogue between this man and his future wife. And they talk about a lot of different things, but this point about catching the little foxes that would destroy their garden that is in bloom, is meant to address the little things that are there, the little problems that stand between us. And the thing about trauma is that I don't go down that list of things to just make everybody feel terrible. The point is that those are the foxes. Those are the foxes in the garden that you and God are trying to create. Our whole relationship with God is not that different from a relationship with anybody else. How are you supposed to understand, have a strong interpretation of God's character when your interpretation of a father is purely something that's accredited to the trauma that you've experienced? How are you supposed to feel comfortable in a church group when all that you have for experience is where the church has abandoned you or hurt you or made you feel marginalized or whatever it is that they've done. And you're supposed to say, okay, I'm supposed to just give myself to this group of people now and trust them to take care of me, to be there for me. These are the things that stand between us. See, and it's not just that, okay? It's not just the idea of whether or not we're able to trust God or understand God or different things like that, but there are other facets where our entire interpretation of God's character can actually become wrapped up in that reward system. A lot of people who have very harsh upbringings migrate to Christianity because the way that Christianity is often approached, is often taught, comes from a very hard-nosed perspective. I usually refer to it as the hammer God. The God who they highlight verses where when God told them not to touch the Ark of the Covenant, and I believe it was one of Aaron's sons, they almost dropped apart, and one of Aaron's sons stepped in to hold it up. They'll highlight a verse like that, and he was killed on the spot. They'll highlight a verse like, Paul, or no, it was Peter. Of course, I can't remember. Anyway, they'll highlight a verse where it talks about how to be afraid of God because he didn't even allow his son to have mercy. He met his son with pain and suffering. They'll highlight verses where we talk about how God punishes this person or that person when he destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah and turned Lot's wife into a pillar of salt when she turned her back to look back at the city. How he punished the Pharaoh, how he punished the armies of Assyria when the king made his little comments to Hezekiah about how he was going to overcome his God. They focus purely on scriptures like that. They love the Old Testament and they live there because it's harsh. When you pull it apart and look at it from a certain perspective and only highlight certain things, it's like reverse cherry picking. A lot of people get mad at the free gracers and the Bethelite kind of Christians. They get mad at them for cherry picking specific verses that say, well, God is a loving God and God wants you to be happy and God wants you to have grace and God wants these things for you and all good things come from God. A lot of those people get very mad at those people and frustrated with them and consider them false Christians, all while doing the exact same thing, just with the opposite perspective. I'm going to find all the most harsh things that I can and develop my faith in God based on that. And I will be terrified of hell and terrified of God too, because he'll send me to hell if I don't be good. And we understand that. We understand that because our childhoods were harsh. Our childhoods were met with conditions that said I have to be this good, otherwise I'm going to get punished over and over and over again until I be that good. And we accept that. And that completely belies everything. It's why so many Christian churches focus on the letters of Paul and the Old Testament instead of reading the Gospels. Rather than highlighting the person that we're supposed to be following the example of, they follow the people that are following his example, kind of. And they make their religion around that. Because Jesus is an anomaly in that point in time. When he's sitting there and talking about certain things, showing love and compassion to people that he technically shouldn't. When he's out hanging out with prostitutes and tax collectors, and he's just getting after the Pharisees for grilling him over it. That makes him anomalous. See, the thing about it is that trauma has a way of affecting our relationship with God on so many different levels. It's not just it makes it hard for you to have a relationship, it's also that it makes it hard for you to even know who he is. to even know who you are, to even know the value of you in his presence. When you sat there and you're told that God gave his only son, not because he was trying to condemn the world, but because he was trying to save the world, and you're part of that. Your entire salvation comes purely off of the fact that God loved you enough to give up something of great value, a part of himself even. We sit there and we don't think about that. It comes back to this point about like, oh, well, I have to earn that then. No, you don't. It's already been given. Imagine being handed the keys to a new car. The new car is laid out before you, and then you spend the rest of your life holding those keys and saying you have to earn this. All you have to do is unlock the car, step into it, and drive it. But we don't. We spend our entire time walking around that car and wondering what we can do to earn the keys, what we can do to earn it. This is a trauma thing, okay? This is something that happens because we can't understand being given something like this. We can't understand this something being laid out for us and it being that easy, because there has to be condition. There has to be something to make it hard. There has to be something that we can earn, something that we can make this, where we can make this feel right. And that's where it's really hard, because we're not conscious of why we feel the way that we feel. And obviously this mentality that I'm talking about is not just purely created by people who have been traumatized. There are plenty of people who have mentalities like this for other reasons. But in my experience, most people who think that way and react that way and live that way, they have some form of trauma. They have some parent who made them feel like they had to prove themselves to be loved. And that in of itself was traumatizing. See, one of the hard things about trauma is like, and don't take this to be in any way, shape, or form like derogatory, but in real life, you have strong people and you have weak people, okay? But with trauma, there's none of that. Because see, whether it takes a little bit of terrible to break you down or a lot of bit of terrible to break you down, if you have trauma, you're broken. Okay? You're on the same level. And I've had a lot of people who, I can think of one person in particular, but I know a lot of people who have trauma and they look at other people who have trauma and judge them. Because they're just like, look how little it took to break you down. I had to go through all these things. It's like, it's weird you gloat about that. It's like the amount of terrible things it took to break you down to the point where you're on the same like standing as these other people. That's not something to gloat about. That's not something to like beat your chest over. That's something to understand, like, yeah, you got broke. And it took a lot because you're a strong person. You should take joy in the fact that you're a strong person, and then stop using it to bludgeon other hurt people over the head.
There are different types of strengths. There's also great value in being soft-hearted, as well as being like kind of letting things bounce off you more.
Of course. But it's just this kind of thing where I see this kind of thing, and it happens a lot. But in the end, it's all equal footing here. Where we've been beaten down, where we've been broken, where there's trauma, we're all coming at this from a place of damage. It's like two paraplegics comparing how they ended up paraplegic. In the end, you're in the same state of things. Like, neither of you are going to be like lifting up those arms and legs. You know, the fact that yours came about because you tripped and fell down the stairs versus you who came about because you crashed your helicopter into a burning building in an attempt to save some people, it doesn't matter. You're both on equal footing on your back. None is better. And this is an important thing for people with trauma to understand, is that what you have gone through, it doesn't need to define you one way or the other, nor should it. See, the trouble with trauma too is that when it's affecting like how we think about things and how we react to things, we don't think about it. And even the things that we do think about, we oftentimes kind of sit with it in this mindset of like, well, this is where I'm at now. This is how we handle these things. And oftentimes it can feel very overwhelming to overcome. Like, how do you beat that? I mean, we literally just talked about how, with PTSD patients, for example, they find that it's almost like it's just etched into people's brains. How do you beat that? It's very hard to do it on your own. But in the end, us as Christians, and, to point back to the last message about medicine at large, the kind of expanded definition of it. This is a place where we can invite God into our lives. See, the things that you have in your brain, the things that you've been trained to believe and think, they're not permanent. Conditioning is never permanent. Oftentimes you have to go through reconditioning or different conditioning. And the thing about it is that God's not beyond doing that. God, in the end, if God wants a relationship with us, we have to kind of come to terms with the reality that He's going to be willing to change the things that make a relationship difficult. So if you're, and I say this, and if you want me to justify it, we can delve through the books of the prophets, all of them, where ever since the books of the Judges, God had been getting after the Israelites for walking away from Him. That's when they started the cycle. Well, technically they started that cycle in the desert with Moses, of coming to Him, and then when they got what they wanted, they turned their backs on Him and started worshiping other gods, and then proceeded to come back to Him again after things got hard. And they maintained this cycle up until, I believe it was the King Josiah. And even him, it was one of the times where Israel turned back to God. And Josiah was allowed to not see Israel fall to the Babylonian army when Jerusalem was finally conquered. The thing with it is that that's hundreds of years. It's hundreds of years of this cycle. And it's hundreds of years of God telling His people, return to me and I will give you a good life. And I'm paraphrasing immensely, because the promises that God offered were far more significant than a good life. Just like the anger that God expressed in the prophets was significantly more than I'm mad at you. The thing was that each of those books in the prophets, there's some aspect of them that's devoted to Him telling His people to return to Him and be saved. And them not heeding those words. If God can spend hundreds of years reaching out to an entire population of people who are completely obstinate, then assuredly He's not going to have a problem spending 10, 20, 30 years reaching out to an individual who wants him but doesn't know how to be close to him because we've been conditioned to think and feel certain other ways. Part of the reason for the Holy Spirit existing with us and within us is to allow us the opportunity to be close to God and to have him be in our lives. In John 16, Jesus explains it pretty succinctly. All of this I've told you so that you will not fall away. They will put you out of the synagogue. In fact, the time is coming when anyone who kills you will think they are offering a service to God. Anyone ever feel that way? Like you've been in the church or different situations and it seems like they gloat over treating you like garbage or making you seem less.
And they're doing it in the name of God.
Right. They will do such things because they have not known the Father or me. I have told you this so that when their time comes, you will remember that I warned you about them. I did not tell you this from the beginning because I was with you. But now I am going to him who sent me. None of you asks me, where are you going? Rather, you are filled with grief because I have said these things. But very truly I tell you, it is for your good that I am going away. Unless I go away, the advocate, or my old Bible used to say counselor.
Mm-hmm.
Supposedly they were both NIV. This kills me. Anyway.
I like that though.
Right. Unless I go away, the advocate will not come to you. But if I go, I will send him to you. When he comes, he will prove the world to be He will prove the world to be in the wrong about sin and righteousness and judgment about sin, because people do not believe in me. About righteousness, because I am going to the Father, where you can see me no longer. And about judgment, because the prince of this world now stands condemned. I have much more to say to you, more than you can now bear. But when he, the Spirit of truth, comes, he will guide you into all the truth. He will not speak on his own. He will speak only what he hears, and what he will tell you, and he will tell you what is yet to come. He will glorify me, because it is from me that he will receive what he will make known to you. All that belongs to the Father is mine. That is why I said the Spirit will receive from me what he will make known to you. The thing is that as he explains here, the Holy Spirit's purpose is to be there with us. Counselor, advocate, whatever you want to call it, the Holy Spirit is meant to be that part of God that lingers with us and stays with us. He's developing a relationship with us. It's the same way that when Jonah went and camped out underneath that vine, mad at God for saving half of a city, God showed up and talked to him. The same is true in so many instances that you see throughout the Old Testament, where you see, was it Elijah who got scared and ran off into the desert when he heard that Jezebel was gonna kill him?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right. Elijah went up and he had that crazy experience where we'll talk more about this when we talk about anxiety, but he had this intense moment where he goes up onto a hill and performs this incredible miracle. The story about the pillars of flame, where he called down the fire from heaven to take that altar, and then also the prophets of Baal, where he was like sitting there teasing them about the whole thing. Dance harder, cut yourselves more. I don't think Baal hears you yet. It's like he had the Baal worshippers, all their prophets, dancing around their altar, praying to Baal to take up the offering. And he prayed to God to do it, and God did it. Fire came down, took it up, took down theirs. And then the next thing that happened was that he heard that Jezebel wanted to kill him, and he panicked and ran off into the wilderness. But God met him there and talked to him. He sent an angel, if I remember correctly. The point is, in all of these instances, this isn't new. Like, it's not new for God to reach out to his own people, the people who he's chosen, which is every single one of us. If Jesus died to save the world, according to his own words, that's not just a select few people. It's everybody. When Paul says, those of you who have been elected, it's a clever way to say, yeah, all of you. So we, being who we are, going like where we have certain traumas that teach us and train us to think a certain way, those are hurdles that are going to have to be overcome, because they're going to make relationship with God difficult. It's no different than if you were to get into a relationship with somebody. You find a new friend, and you have to overcome what you already feel about your friends. You find a new church, and you have to overcome the traumas that you've experienced with your old churches. You find a new partner, and you have to overcome your experiences that you've had with other partners. It's not different with God. And the truth is that we actually spend a lot of time projecting on God things from our pasts. And it's not just the things that are fair to ask, like, where were you? But it's the stuff where it's like we hear that he's our father, and then we look at our real life dads as examples of what he's supposed to be like. So we run into this problem. If we had a good dad, it's a little easier, but it's still hard because God's different. I've had to explain this before, where it's like, God is not your parents. He's God. He has his own person, his own character, his own way of thinking about things that's very different from any of your parents. And that works with both the good parents and the bad parents. And that's especially important with both the good parents and the bad parents. It's just important in general to see God for who he is. He's your father, but he's not your dad or your mom. And the point of this message, talking about trauma again, is to highlight this as a thing and to bring it up as something to be prayed into. Because again, we don't think about it. We might have a few things highlighted. We might have a few things that pop up, if we're in therapy or anything like that. We'll have counselors explain, like, this is a trauma response. Well, if you hear that, cling to that. That's important. Because that's something that's going to inhibit you in a lot of different ways. It's not impossible to overcome, it's just hard. But thankfully, when Jesus says that he believes that through God all things are possible, he has a fairly extensive is a good word. He has a fairly educated opinion on that.
Yeah.
Like, he knows what he's talking about. And that's something to take hope in. And to know that, whatever it is that's going on, if you have like this deep need to please people that comes from the fact that you had to earn the love of your parents, That's not forever. And God will make that difficult. And I don't mean that in a bad way, like he's just going to make it hard for you or tease you or anything. I mean that he will love you anyways and show you that he loves you again and again and again, and challenge that mentality again and again and again as you try to earn that love that's already there. But in the end, all this stuff, the trauma that we have, this is stuff to be lifted up in prayer. We ask God to make straight the crooked paths in our own brains, in our own minds, that tell us that this is how we have to live. The things that hold us in bondage to mentalities that we don't need anymore, and that we never should have had before. I want you to understand something very clearly before we close out this message. One of the important things about trauma to remember is that it's not your fault. Even if you chose a situation, like a lot of people who have bad partners, they'll oftentimes cite that, well, I chose to stay in a relationship with them. Okay, that's fine. Yeah, you chose that. However, they chose to hurt you. And that's not your fault. That's theirs. The responsibility to act that way lands squarely on their shoulders, and that's not yours to carry around. The same is true with parents. You could have left, you could have run away, you could have done any number of different things. It doesn't matter. The fault is on their shoulders. They made the decisions that they made and they hurt you, and that makes them the bad guys. They were wrong. And that's the end of it. You don't take responsibility for the people that hurt you. Like, unless you walked into the bar, punched somebody in the face, picked the fight, that's not yours. That responsibility is not yours. Being born with a particular pair of people was never something you chose. Getting into a relationship with somebody who convinced you that they were great and then finding out that they weren't was not your choice. You believed a lie, but they lied to you. Okay? Or they changed over the course of time or whatever. That church that abandoned you, rejected you, made you feel like a monster, that's not your fault. They chose how they were going to respond. They chose how they were going to act. They made those decisions. And even if you did things to inspire some element of it, they still had a decision to make between offering reconciliation or judgment. And they chose judgment and abandonment and rejection. And you can cite Paul about where he says, I gave these people over to Satan. Because a lot of churches do. A lot of churches will cite that as the excuse for why they abandon people. But it's really, and pardon my language, but it's really a fucking lazy excuse for people who just didn't want to try. And they felt more comfortable offering judgment and abandonment.
I thought about what you're saying about how God loves us. It shows us that in ways over and over and over. I don't remember if I heard this from someone or just kind of realized it a while back, but I think one of the reasons he does that specifically over and over and over is because it can hurt less to believe that something bad happened because we deserve it than something bad happened and it was a huge injustice.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
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 And so he'll go to great lengths to work past that boundary of,
That we developed to like cope.
of not wanting love,
Mhm.
because the lack of love in the past is more painful than not having love now.
Right.
Mm.
But yeah. So with all that said, like, that's about what I've got.